We're going to talk about what generative is. A lot of people have a problem being generative. Let's talk about what generative is and sort of the way this came up. So a lot of times, Manuel and I in particular will explain to people, when they're saying stuff, they're not being generative or that's not generative. And people get upset because they're like, I don't know what do you mean? What do you mean generative? I'm saying things are happening in the world. So what do we mean by generative? What does it mean to generate something, to be generative? And generation for us sort of in the recent times is all about power, usually electrical power, right? We talk about electrical generation. That's a big topic. How do we generate our energy? Where does our electricity come from? What's our electric generation? But the problem with that sort of oversimplification is that we use the term power in all kinds of like crazy ways. Like we're just all over the place. And we don't have a good definition of power. I mean, most of us, of course. I have a video on that. So yeah, I mean, we have to think about that. What does generation actually point to? Because it's not always like something from nothing. But we'll see often we think of it that way. We think of, oh, there's nothing there and we've generated something. And of course, the easiest way to do that is quote generating an idea. And we'll go into that more later. So being generative, generation as in generations of persons, I think is a better way to think about it. So again, it's not something from nothing, but something where there was nothing manifest before. And that's what I want you to consider is this idea of manifestation and how value and generation are connected. Because if there was nothing there, we'll say, and then something was there, was it generated or did it move from somewhere else? Because that's really the issue. Just because something's there doesn't mean it was generated. It could have been moved. You could argue, oh, you generated something in moving it. I would say no. You just, move things. And this is, again, one of these places where people get sort of wrapped up. They get really confused. They get stuck in this idea like, well, what do we mean? How do we come to terms with generation? What is generation? Why is generation valuable? This is why it's wrapped up in the concept of value. If something can be generated, it should be of value or it should have a value, right? It should have certain qualities, not quantities, qualities. Electrical power has qualities. You can measure some of electrical power in quantity, but it's the qualities that we use it for, not the numbers. The numbers help us describe it, help us understand it. And it's the same thing with all generation. What we're generating is something with a set of qualities. And value doesn't generate things, but it helps you to generate things. And that's going to get wrapped up, and I'll talk about this later too, principles. So what I'm trying to outline here is the process of generation is bringing potential into being, manifesting that potential. Several components, aspects, values, principles, combining or becoming ordered, placed into a pattern, a relationship, hopefully a right relationship, or a form, becoming informed. And then once you've done that, whatever that entails, it probably entails quite a bit of effort, actually. Now it must be cultivated. Because a lot of people say, oh, well, something's generated and therefore that's good. We can walk away now. We generated something. It's like, ooh, I think once you generate something, you have a responsibility. That's, I think, one of those places where people get a little lost. Like, yeah, the generation side happened. But now there's a cultivation, there's a responsibility. If something has been generated, especially if it's good, you want it to continue. So you need to account for that in your sort of definition and conception of generation. Do all the things you think of manifest in the world? Like everything that you think, is that going to become manifest in the world? Obviously not. We have dreams, we have fantasies, we have ideas all the time. Oh, I'm going to be Elon Musk, and doesn't happen. So how do we sort of get a handle on things being generated? What is generative if it's not just our thoughts, we'll say? And it's not to say thoughts aren't important, but they're not the generative component. It might be an aspect of generation, but they can't be the only aspect. They can't be the only way to generate things. And, you know, we need to struggle with the idea of what's generative. When are we wasting time? And when are we being generative? When are we able to act within the world in a way that things happen that are able to be cultivated, that are able to persist? That's the formation, the informing of things that makes them generative. It's that manifestation that we should now care for, or at least pay attention to, or at least have other people who can care for. You see this a lot in businesses. Like when you start a business, you're not you're not the business. The business is technically and legally a separate entity, and other people participate in it, and that is generative. So referring to the higher thing, the thing that isn't just me or me and my idea, but also has a structure to it, a formation. You form a company. That is what generates a business. Until then, it's just an idea. I mean, you just set up business paperwork and file it with the state and don't do anything with it. That's not generative. I mean, you generated a bunch of paperwork maybe, but nothing happened. So that's what to sort of think of. And you can say, look, Master Muppet, all this negative talk, but perhaps you need the contrast to see. So a lot of things just aren't generative. So what is this generative? Action. Action. We've talked about action before. A previous live stream on action, wonderful live stream, check it out. Action isn't just what's in your head. What's in your head can help you take action, but it isn't an action. And not all action is generative. Like some action is destructive. So you can't link the two all that tightly, right? But you need action to be generative. What is the aspect of action that's generative? Because as I'm pointing out, this is a problem. You can't go, I took an action and therefore I'm generative. And that's the worst, because I'm not here to solve a problem for you, to give you answers. That's not what I'm here for. That's not what this is all about. What this is about is pointing out the difficulties in especially these concepts, but in the world in general. Like, things are difficult, man. We tend to think, oh, I know exactly what action is. I know exactly how to be generative. I know exactly. No, you don't. You don't. And that's the thing. We have to let that sink in. We have to ask the question of ourselves in the moment, am I being generative? Am I generating something that requires and can be cultivated? Because if you're not, maybe you're being destructive. And I'm not saying you should never be destructive. I certainly don't believe that. Sometimes things have to be destroyed so new things can be put in their place. Where do the components for generation come from? Sometimes they come from old dead things that you've destroyed. You ever play with Legos? You build your nice little Lego spaceship. You built the spaceship, right? Then you want to build something else. You got to take the spaceship apart. There's your destructive aspect. You got to take something that you had manifested, that was generated, destroy it, and then put it back, put something else in its place. And that cyclical nature to being generative is important, because things you generate, maybe they don't last forever. Maybe they're not supposed to. Maybe they're only supposed to last for a short time. The fact that they last for a short time doesn't mean you weren't generative. People get caught up in that too, right? You get the people who, oh, why bother? It's the heat death of the universe anyway. Yeah, well, that's not generative. That attitude is not generative, because then why would you actually bother to generate anything to make things that you can cultivate? And look, let that sink in. So now, let me be clear, because this is the postmodern problem of our age. And obviously, I've talked about the postmodern problem of our age before. I have a video on it. Criticism, in and of itself, is not generative. Okay? The fact that it could lead to something generative is not a function of the criticism or the critique. And lots of other things are far better at being generative. Okay? The fact that you engage in criticism and that sometimes that makes people think about their points is not necessarily anything that is going to lead anywhere. And it may not lead to the good, even if it leads somewhere. And these are actual important considerations that people do not generally account for whatever reason. Lots of things are better than criticism and critique at being generative. So this is all about time, energy, and attention, and using that effectively to become a creator, or perhaps better said, a manifesting agent. An agent that can manifest things in the world, that can generate things. So manifestation is wrapped up in creation, in being, right? In agency, in generation. Without agents, generation doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. It doesn't work. And so when you're engaging in, we'll say, a critique, or you're finding a flaw with someone's argument, or you're looking for a way in which they're wrong. And the problem is with communication, language in general, and again, this is the postmodern problem, language is imprecise. So the fact that you can find an imprecision or an inaccuracy in speech is a given. It's not a bonus point. It's a Captain Obvious moment. The fact that sometimes you can point out a flaw in someone's logic, and sometimes that's actually relevant, and sometimes they actually understand it, and sometimes they correct themselves because of it, doesn't make it generative. Doesn't mean good things can't come from it, but the odds of all that happening are small. Even if you're right and they're wrong and they don't acknowledge that they're wrong, not going to do you any good. And so we have to be careful with this idea of critique, or this non-existent notion of deconstruction, which is just garbage. You're just talking about destruction. And calling it something fancy to sound good. But if you think about the idea of deconstruction, it's foolish. To construct is the process of being generative, putting things together and manifesting in the world. You can't undo that or reverse it. A lot of things are not symmetrical and can't be reversed. Our whole universe, the whole way in which we exist, is asymmetrical. This assumption of symmetry is foolishness. And that's why generative is so hard for people, because they don't realize it's very easy to blow up a building. It's very hard to construct a building, right? It's very easy to take someone's life. I studied martial arts. I can tell you, they taught me lots of ways to kill people. Fortunately, very easy. It's not that hard. People are pretty fragile creatures at the end of the day. But it's very hard to generate life like that and cultivate it and manifest it. Raising children is not a trivial thing, right? It's a non-trivial thing. And that's where people get wrapped up, is that generative is hard. It's not easy. It's nice when you get things in your head and you can do them very quickly with very little effort, and that feels good. And it feels good in the moment, and it's always accessible to you. You can always have a good idea, or what seems to you to be a good idea. But you're not necessarily being generative. A lot of times you're just wasting time. And you're not putting your time, energy, and attention to some place where your time, energy, and attention can manifest into something that you can cultivate that will do something in the world outside of your thoughts. And again, this is wrapped up in action. Did a live stream on action. I talked about that. Action has to be outside yourself. You have to have independent measurement of it. And so we get wrapped up with this idea of being creators of the world or whatever, and it being easy because we can think. And you can go, oh, well, it's not that easy. We also have to think out loud with our language or whatever. And this fools us into believing we're being generative when we're not. We have to use our time, energy, and attention, employ our agency, and move things in the world. That's what being generative is all about. That's why a lot of people will talk about negative thoughts and negative thinking and say, well, that's not generative. Fair enough. Negative thoughts are not generative. That's true. So generative is hard because it's not just you. And anytime something isn't just you, just within your head, just within your total control, or the most control that you have is the control over your own imagination, we'll say, then you run into problems. And the problems you run into are constraints from the external world, constraints of time, constraints of resources, constraints of energy, constraints of attention, other people, other items in the world. Sometimes you're doing something and you just run out of energy. Sometimes you're doing something and someone comes along and needs help. You got to stop what you're doing. All of these things are impediments to generation. So we tend to try to do it in our head. And things can get really tricky here, right? When we talk about sort of what's pre-existing and what's generated, how much power we have to generate, right? We have some responsibility for reality, right? But how much? And how much is tricky? And how much responsibility do we have for the things we generate if we're not generating them alone by ourselves in our head? These are tricky things. And whether or not something gets generated is largely a function of how much time, energy, and attention you put into it over how long a period of time. And if no one takes responsibility for that, things don't last. If nobody pays attention to a company, eventually it dies. And that goes for all your projects. If you don't cultivate your garden, you'll lose it. That happens. So you need to find a way to be generative so that the world continues. It's that big. I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about this. Like, what if everything you do matters? Yeah. The inverse property is true too. What if the things you don't do have an impact? Like your lack of involvement in things also has an impact. You're busy playing video games or drinking yourself into a stupor or snorting coke or shooting heroin or watching porn all day or whatever it is. You're not generating things. You're being parasitic upon the things that have already pre-existed you, right? Upon other people. You want to talk about, oh, we're slaves to the man or whatever. We're all slaves to each other to some extent, because I don't know about you, but I don't generate my own electricity. And to the extent that I can't generate enough to run all the stuff in this house. And even if I did, boy, I'd have to get some copper, and I probably didn't mine the copper or refine it. It goes on and on. Like, I didn't design and develop the computers. I didn't build them. Maybe I could, but I didn't. And so all these other people are wrapped up in this. Whether they're still alive or not, it's not relevant. They generated something and we're using that. And if we're not responsible for regenerating it, then, we won't have it eventually. But we tend in the scientific frame to fall into this idea of the pre-existence of things. And we're not taking that level of responsibility for the fact that things need to be created or manifest in the world, generated, regenerated, and continued. And it's a tricky thing. Like, I'm not here to give you answers. These are hard things to think about. But, presumably you're here to think about them. And look, there's fake it till you make it. And there's a point in that. But doing things doesn't guarantee outcome. You aren't the thing you want to be until you try to be the thing. So there's a gap there between the idea that you want to manifest or generate in the world and actually generating it. There's the idea of having a company, and then there's all the work that goes into creating the structure for a company, and then there's all the work that goes into putting that structure into action and manifesting the company. And that goes for everything. If you want to be a world champion snowboarder, you're not the world champion snowboarder when you start. You have to generate that world champion aspect to you. You have to fake it till you make it, kind of. Because there's a gap, right? And while you're trying to be the thing, you're, quote, faking it. I mean, I get it, but this ignores time. It kills the idea of generative, because generative has to happen over time. And we've compressed time down into this thing that doesn't exist anymore. So everything's kind of pre-existing. And I get that. It's very comfortable to exist in a pre-existing world. You're not imposing on anybody. All the things you have are yours because they were there before you. So they're just kind of there. They're yours. You can do whatever you want with them. You don't have to be generative. You don't have to generate new things because you have all the things you need. It's very tempting to have that attitude about it. But that's why thinking about being generative is important. You have to think about when and where you can generate things, where you can be generative instead of just tearing things down because you're still in the world. You're still acting in the world, whether you like it or not. That means you're judging. That means you're making discernments. Those are inevitable for action. And action is inevitable for life. To be alive is to take action. When you're not taking action, you're dead. You can argue about lesser and greater degrees of being alive. Like if you're just caught in a drunken stupor, maybe you're less alive. Maybe. You weren't when you were drinking to get into the stupor. Are you being generative? No. No, you're not being generative. But that's coming at a cost somewhere and not just to you because you're in a world with other people. So that's something worth thinking about. In regeneration, taking something that was generated and vivifying it, redeeming it, giving it new life, putting your time, energy, and attention into it to make it better. That's generative. It doesn't have to be from nothing. And this theme of generation and being generative comes up a lot in the best science fiction show of all time, Blake Seven, in season 4, episode 2. And I did write that in my notes. I did remember it from memory. I did check it on the internet. That's the step people always miss, checking their own work. And it's called Power, which is just funny. I wonder where I got all this stuff from. I don't know. Anyway, it's about a war of the sexes, basically. And it's kind of odd for the time because this is what, the early 80s, season 4, yeah, it was at 81, 82, something like that. So you can see these deep patterns have been around a while. And the basic premise of the episode is that, they're on this planet and there's a war between the men and the women. And the women have these magical necklaces with this magical crystal on it, basically, that they happen to need, by the way, to do teleportation, because, of course. So it's not an implication. The crystal that allows the women to do telekinesis and to have supernatural, if you will, strength is also the crystal that enables teleportation of matter across distance in very little time. So dynamon, I think it's called dynamon crystals. Anyway, so there's this idea in there that the crystals take and amplify energies, including psychic energies. When the women get power in the episode, when they get this ability to do this, they free themselves from the men. But unfortunately, then there's no babies anymore. Does this sound like a familiar argument? This is the early 1980s, guys. And I know, look, science fiction precedes. Sure, of course, it does. Absolutely. But this pattern has come up before, and it keeps coming up. This pattern of what is generation. And that's the generation. That's big G generation, generation of life, right? Generation of being, bringing new being into the world. If you want sort of the ultimate ideal of generation, I think it's children, guys. I hope that I hope this doesn't come as a shock. So the idea of children is all about generation. You're generating being in the moment. You're creating being, manifesting being in the world, and that takes cultivation. Because it turns out, even though Rousseau wrote about this, he apparently wasn't being serious, even though people took him seriously because he's an irresponsible jerk. You can't just have a baby and leave it in the woods. That's not gonna work out for the baby. And you're gonna pay the cost of having the baby without getting the advantages of seeing it grow up and maybe contribute to your life. because babies very much are generative of your re-enchantment of the world. And Jordan Peterson talks about this, like as people watch children notice houses and ask questions about what about that house, they give you these details that you had glossed over through years of just engaging with how there's another house, there's another house, there's another house, right? Children, they ask so many questions, they pay attention to different things, they notice different details, details you may have glossed over, and they revivify the world for you or regenerate it. So this is an important way to think about it, is this revivification, this regeneration of the world. And that's why you want to be generative of being in that way, because now that being can help regenerate the world, revivify the world for you. That's sort of like the payback from the cost of bringing this being in to existence. And the generation of the child, and again, I went over this in the beginning, right? Generations, right? Generations of people. That's generative is wrapped up in that. That is the thing that continues. Why? Things that are just random can't continue. Not that they won't be around for some unspecified amount of time. They're random. So they're emerging, they're popping into existence, but they're not staying there. So that's worth thinking about, is this nature of forming, right? The thing that is generated, and maybe the process of generation is about the formation, because maybe just having a bunch of Legos on the ground is not generative. You generate the spaceship, you built spaceships, your Legos, right? I hope so. You generate the spaceship using the Legos and your time, energy, and attention. And again, that's not all there is to generation, but and I want to switch gears back to the thing I alluded to earlier, which is critique. Ideas are not generative. They may lead to something generative. But the problem is, this is just a hallucination. We talked about this before on a previous live stream. Hallucination, right? It has no external effect on the world. I have ideas all the time. You know nothing about them. You will know nothing about almost all of them. Most of my ideas are not wrapped up in the live stream. Where I get ideas for topics for the live stream are from other people and their struggles. And then I go, why are you struggling with that, Muppet? That's easy. And then I go, oh, but how do I explain it? That's not easy. And not to detour us too much, but look, we always get this idea that we know something and that knowledge is this one static state that is easily accessible and well understood and bounded, but it's not. There are things that I know so well that I'm not even aware of their knowledge. And usually what happens is I'll refer to those as common sense. And I think we all do that. When people say common sense, what they mean is things they know so well that they can't describe them in language at all. They're just like, well, why would that ever happen? So everybody knows the world isn't set up that way or something. And I don't think we give that enough credit. Like, I don't think that we really pay enough attention to that to go, oh, wait a minute, that's true. We say common sense, and we can't describe what the common sense thing is and why it's common and why it's sensible. Because we know it too deeply. We know it embodied. This is Piaget, right? This is more Peterson. Piaget, we know this thing embodied. It's something that we participated with, that we grew up with. And so there's things that we'll say we know that well. Then there's things we know well enough that we can interact with them, but we can't describe them to others. But clearly we have a competence in them. And I think those are two different types of knowledge. And then I think there's things that we know well enough to discuss with somebody with a similar enough experience. I don't want to say an expert, but that gets a little tricky because you're appealing to an objective third party sort of authority. But let's say two carpenters have an easy time talking about their building tricks and techniques to each other. And that's easier than talking to somebody who's has never worked on a building before, never worked in carpentry. So there's that level of knowledge. Then there's the level of knowledge where you can explain it to, say, most people who are aware of most things. And then there's a level of knowledge where you can actually teach it. And see, there's a lot there. And I don't want to get that too wrapped up in generative, because I think there's a split. There's that old saying, those who can do, those who can't teach. There's exceptions to those rules. Sometimes people do things, and then when they get too old to do them or they're bored, they go and teach them. Some of those people are really good teachers, and some of those people are really terrible teachers, in my experience. So, not solving a problem there. But this is the problem. We get wrapped up in ideas, and we don't realize there's levels to ideas. There's these deep levels. And you don't have an external effect in the world with your ideas. Nothing is spread to others until it's put into action. And you can say, look, one action that you can point to with ideas is speaking them out. Okay, kind of, right? But that is at least external to you. And again, I went over this in my live stream on action. It's got to be external to you for reasons. There are good reasons behind this. Philosophy is not generative. Do you generate ideas? Do you? Or do they come to you? Are they the synthesis of that which is already within you and something outside of you? Are you generating them? And even if you're generating the ideas, is that generative? Because again, the generative stuff is what's outside of you. It's not the stuff in your head. There's no action involved. There's not to say that there can't be. It's just to re-enchant this idea. You can't compress the world down to, I have an idea, therefore I'm generative. What? And people do. People do this all the time. You see it all the time. Oh, Elon Musk, he just has good ideas, and that's why he has all this money. Goodness, no. He actually produces product for people. Does he physically do it himself? No, but he informs people, forms people around producing that product. Well, he didn't build Tesla. Well, he took Tesla from what it was and made it what it is. That's generative. Do people have ideas, or do ideas have people? It's not a statement. It's two questions. Might answering these questions generate something? Or does it lead to more questions? Perhaps it just breaks down your certainty and puts you into wonder. Is that generative? It can be. It isn't in and of itself, by itself. Thinking things through propositionally gives you the feeling of having accomplished something. But it's not necessarily generative. It can be, it can lead to something generative, but it's not generative by itself. Ideas are not generative. You'll generate ideas without doing anything, no process, no effort, nothing, and things will be generated without ideas. There has to be a space into which you generate. That space must be opened. Perhaps it is opened by ideas or by silence, or sometimes by perspective or a change in perspective. Our realization. But then they aren't generation. It's just the recognition of the potential of generation. Welcome to the enchantment of the world. The world is not simply made up of pre-existing things that are already there, or things that are there and then you see them, or things that are there and then you see them and you do something with them and things pop in. No, it's way more complex than that. We don't just have ideas and things generate and manifest in the world. You need that discernment, judgment, action. The idea itself is insufficient. It's a mere hallucination. It's just imaginal. And things that are imaginal are inside your head. They are not outside in the world. They're not generative. They can lead to something that can be generative. They can lead to manifestation, but also none of that is required. The world is full of randomness. Things will randomly generate. Things will emerge without any effort on your part or anyone else's. This world is full of randomness. That's terrifying. Maybe that's why we have the concepts of good and evil. Things are randomly popping up. How do we know if they're good or not? Emergence is not good. Could be good. Maybe goodness has to be cultivated because it's rare and it's formed and it's shaped. Maybe the same is true for truth and beauty. Beauty pops up randomly, happens all the time. Doesn't mean it's good. Doesn't mean it's true. Now, the real issue becomes, do you stay in your head, in fantasy land, trapped in thinking, where there are fewer consequences being generated? Or do you take an action with an unknown impact? This is a false dichotomy. Impacts are going to happen to you whether you take an action or not. The rest of the world is still there. You don't get around anything by drinking yourself into a stupor or shooting heroin all day or snorting coke or playing video games or just hanging out with your porn. And damn it, Mark, why did you do that to me? And why did I indeed? It's a false choice. Not taking an action means time still passes. Things still happen outside of you. And sure, sometimes you have little or no control or influence, and you need to step back to wait, to have things unfold until there is or is not space for you to act appropriately or inappropriately. And I think that's part of wisdom. Understanding these things. Because again, things are constantly emerging. And all that is emergent is not generative, even if it could be. The fact that generative things seem to be happening all the time is an illusion. It's just randomness. Could be, but this is where people get deeply confused. At least apparently to me, they just constantly. And this is much to my personal dismay and disappointment. Like people are constantly, oh, well, we'll just do this. We'll just get this thing together or this group together or whatever, and something will emerge. It's like, well, yeah, something might emerge. Is that generative or is it destructive? Because a lot of groups, mobs destroy things all the time. Occupy Wall Street wasn't generative. There was a lot of time, energy, and attention to it. Oh, we're going to get together and we're going to protest and we're going to walk down the street and that's going to change the world like it did in the civil rights era. The civil rights era was informed. It was formed towards a purpose or a telos, all right? And it had a driving ethos behind it to generate a series of changes, mostly legal changes, but also changes in attention primarily that led to all the other changes, including the legal ones. And that is what enabled that to generate a better world. It wasn't just get in the streets and whine about wealthy bankers. Look, I was in the middle of the Occupy Wall Street thing to some extent because I was getting my house taken. I'm screaming at these people. I'm like, why aren't you here protecting the houses that are being illegally foreclosed on? Why are you there at the wrong banks? You know, not that they're necessarily the wrong banks. I mean, they certainly contributed, but they weren't the ones taking the physical action to foreclose on houses. And it's not like that wasn't discussed. It's not like that never happened. There were a couple people that they occupied houses and prevented foreclosures, but only a handful, right? There were probably hundreds of thousands of foreclosures that were illegal. Those Occupy Wall Street people didn't do anything. It wasn't generative, it was mostly destructive. It's not that they didn't have an impact, but it wasn't informed. It didn't generate positive anything over the long term. Generated a lot of negative changes, made the problem worse, that's for sure. Tim Pool talks a lot about this because he was on the ground at Occupy Wall Street. He has some wonderful stories about his time on the ground there, reporting, doing real reporting, as he's still doing. Good for him. It wasn't generative. And this is part of this deep confusion around emergence. Things that emerge are not necessarily going to be generative. And even if they are, that doesn't mean they're good. Doesn't mean they're true, and it doesn't mean they're beautiful. Dictators of the 1900s. Some of it wasn't true. Some of it wasn't beautiful. None of it was good. Some of it was beautiful. Beauty is a good way to trap people. You can just show them something beautiful, and they're like, "Oh, that's beautiful. We'll go where you're going." Yeah, yeah, that happened. That definitely happened. You study dictators of the 1900s, you'll see that all over the place. The instantiation of beauty as a lure to get people in to something that wasn't good. Did I mention that it wasn't good? Because we're confused on that point. And sometimes things are true and beautiful and not good. And you could argue, oh, you can generate a great army that takes over the world or could take over the world. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. You can. Generative isn't some magical solution. Went over that earlier. And this is where we get into this idea of determinism. Determinism is definitionally non-generative. Definitionally. Determinism is the statement that generative doesn't exist. It's this compression. And how do we get there? How do we get to this determinism idea? This is so dumb. It's hard to imagine how anybody can possibly twist their brain into this. And yet Sam Harris manages it seemingly without effort. We get confused by constraints. What we're constrained by versus what we're determined by. Okay? If you want to talk about what we're determined by our ineffable creator. However that works. However you conceive that to be. I don't really care. Right? If you have a conception, probably a Christian conception, great. If you have a Buddhist conception, if you're in the West, it's probably wrong, but whatever, you have one, right? If you're in the East, you probably have a better conception of the Buddhist conception. That's what determined means, which is to say it's not something we can understand. Like it's so much bigger than us. That's why it's ineffable. So much bigger than us that we can't understand it. That's okay. Lots of things we can't understand. I can't understand most things. I'm still alive. People in the 1800s couldn't understand a tenth of what we understand about technology. They managed just fine. I know that because we're here. Like, if knowledge at this level were required to survive, we wouldn't be here to have the knowledge at this level. It's really not a difficult thing. And so we're not constrained by lack of knowledge, at least not in the recent conception of knowledge. We're not constrained by lack of propositional understanding. We're not constrained by lack of science. We're not constrained by those things. Those things do not constrain us. Being determined comes from above, and you have no choice. Control is outside of you entirely. And that's why there's no space to be generative, because you're no longer an agent in the world. That's why selling determinism is difficult, because people are like, wait, then I'm not an agent in the world. That's technically correct. You're not an agent in the world if determinism is true. That's why determinism is not true. And what people are looking at is constraint and saying, well, I can't make any choice I want, any way I want, with any set of consequences I choose, and therefore it must be determined. It's like, man, you just compressed everything right down to nothing. And I understand your frustration because you're not living in the world in your head. Totally get that. The world in your head's not generative, dude. And just because something is generative doesn't mean it's not subject to constraints. Like, that's crazy. In fact, without the constraints, generative can't exist. That's what's worth thinking about. Being generative means being responsible. That's why I talked about cultivation. It's important to know that things are going to be generated around you. And if you took no control over, responsibility for it, have no influence over them, yeah, the world's going to feel determined to you. Yeah, maybe you won't cultivate things. Maybe you'll just let the weeds grow in the garden. And maybe they'll take over. And then you will be more constrained than you would have been had you cultivated things. Yeah. Where do you think clean your room comes from? Jordan Peterson talks about this. Why do you clean your room? That's a form of cultivation. And once you learn to cultivate and see the benefits of cultivation, it generates the ability to do more. You can, to use Vervaeke language, exact that out. Oh, I can clean my room. Oh, I can clean the house. Oh, I can clean the street when I'm walking on it and see trash. Oh, all of this has a positive impact on the world. It makes the world a better place and forms the world a certain way. Because if you let nature form the world, it'll get wild and overrun. I know I've got 12 acres of land. Like, it's not hard. Why did I have a snake in my house? Well, because I didn't mow the lawn. That's what happens. Then you get the snakes. They get out of the garden and come into your house and scare the ever living bejesus out of you. Can confirm. And I just want to make an important point where another point where people who will have a say they have a more nuanced, a more enchanted view of the world, they will try to redeem things. And I've seen this a lot lately with say something like the so-called Barbie movie. Barbie is not a movie. It's a piece of media for sure. It's not a movie. It's not a film. They try to redeem this and say, oh, look, there's a good message here somewhere. And there's lots of good messages in there. There's an equal number of bad messages in there. What are we saying? You can't redeem everything. You shouldn't redeem everything. And I would argue you can't redeem things that aren't asking for redemption. Maybe you can only redeem beings, people. Maybe. Not here to give you answers. But redeeming is not necessarily generative. And putting effort that would be generative into something like redemption might be a waste of your time, energy, and attention. I'm not going to state that outright, but it's certainly possible. And you need to account for that because I think it's important. Being generative is important. Jordan Peterson wouldn't tell you to clean up your room if it weren't. The ability to redeem is important, but it's not universally applicable because you feel like it. It's a relationship. Being generative in general is about a relationship, a formation, information. You have to put things in formation to generate something, we'll say, outside of the things you started with. To enchant the world, to make it bigger. I think those are the important points. It's not just some random generation and then poof. Being generative needs to be deliberate, well thought out, carefully considered. It needs to have these qualities. Thank you very much for your time and attention.